Hello, Dr. Mashburn here, and we're going to continue with our bone labs. And today we're going to talk about the axial skeleton, and in particular the skull. If you'll remember, the axial skeleton includes your skull, your ribs, and your vertebral column. So today we're going to focus on the skull, and in particular the bones that make up the cranium. So if you haven't done this already, be sure that you have downloaded this lab guide that will give you a list of bones that you're required to know, as well as the features. Our lab guide is divided into two columns. You have a column on the left with the bone name, the column on the right with the features name. So as we go through these bones, I'm going to try to follow along in the same order as your lab guide. I will point out the bone to you and also some of the features you're expected to know. Now, there's many features in your textbook. Only learn the features that we show you in the lab guide and I point out to you in the video. These words are the words that you're required to recall for your lab exam. You also need to work on spelling because we do count off for spelling, so be sure you can spell these bone and feature names. Alright, so today we're talking about the skull, in particular the cranial bones. If you look at the skull, we divide it into the bones of the cranium and the facial bones. The bones of the cranium are the ones that surround the brain. So the brain would be encased in these cranial bones. So all the bones that form this vault that holds your brain make up the cranial bones, and all the bones that form your face are your facial bones. And so we'll do this in another video. So today it's just going to be the cranial bones. Now these next couple of slides is just as a reminder that the skull is a 3D object. So as we're learning the bones, you want to think about these bones in every orientation, from the front, from the side, from the top, from underneath, okay? And as we test you on these bones, we may use images. They may be from your textbook, they may be from other sources, or you may see pictures of the actual skulls that we have here at the college in lab. So again, you may see diagrams, you may see actual images. And these images can be in any orientation. You may see them from the front, you may see them from the side, so this would be this side or this side. So again, you need to be able to recognize that this bone here is the same as this bone here, okay? So learn these images not only as your textbook images, but also as the actual skull images from many different directions. You also want to remember the skull can be turned upside down, so you want to be able to see it from the bottom side. So this would be a picture of one of our skulls that we're looking up from the bottom. This is actually the foramen magnum, this big hole here where your spinal cord comes out. In this image, we've removed the lower jawbone, and you can see into the upper jaw. So again, remember these bones as 3D objects, and you'll have some YouTube videos where it's a little bit easier to see it in 3D. So not only watch these videos, but also watch the YouTube videos done by Ms. Graham. All right, and also, not only do you have to think about the bones from the outside, remember this is a 3D object, and you can take the skull apart and look on the inside. So you'll also be required not only to be able to identify the bone by looking at it from the outside, you have to imagine what it looks like from the inside of the skull. Okay, so we can take the skull, take it apart, and recognize the bones from a different perspective. So again, these are 3D objects, so it's going to be a little difficult to do this from a PowerPoint, but again, if you'll watch the YouTube videos, that will help you to think about this as a more 3D dynamic type of a structure. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, we're going to go down your lab guide, and we're going to cover the sutures. And sutures are joints. And they're the joints, so you think about when you suture somebody up, you sew them together. The joints, the sutures are the joints that hold the bones of the skull together. And on our models, they have these little yellow lines, okay? So anywhere that you see a yellow line, these are all suture lines where these bones are articulating or joining together. So there's many sutures on the skull. You're only required to learn these four: the coronal, sagittal, lambdoid, and squamosal. So the coronal suture is the one that goes across from left to right across the top of the skull. It's this one here, okay, here to here. So you see it in this picture, also this picture. Now, when we talked about planes, we talked about you had a coronal plane, also known as a frontal plane. You can't call that the frontal suture, so you can't do that. because there's actually a suture in the infant that runs this way, so it runs between the kind of in a perpendicular to that, called the frontal suture. So we don't have that as an adult. It's in the infant. So again, so the coronal and frontal sutures are not the same thing. The sagittal suture, this would be the sagittal suture. It divides the skull from left and right. It runs right along the top. So if you could look down on the skull this way, it'll be right along the top here. Okay, so that's your sagittal suture. Your lambdoid suture is on the back, and so it's going to be this back suture here. Okay, so you can sort of see it a little bit right here. Again, look in your textbook and you'll also see it. The lambdoid suture goes all the way around and comes around all the way down around the bottom. Okay, so that's your lambdoid suture. And your squamosal suture is this one on the side. Okay, so right here, that's your squamosal suture. So you actually have two of those because you have a squamosal suture on the left and the right side. So those are your suture lines, and you'll need to be able to identify those as well as be able to spell them. All right, again, so look in not only your textbook but also on these videos. Again, if you haven't remembered to do this on the Start Here page, you do have that online lab guide with a lot of with more pictures and even more labeled pictures. So make sure you take some time to look at that as well if you need it. All right, there are 8 cranial bones. You have 1 frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, 1 occipital bone, 2 temporal bones, 1 sphenoid bone, and 1 ethmoid bone. So I'm going to point out these bones on this slide. This is your frontal bone. Okay, you have 1 of those. This is your parietal bone, and then there's 1 on the other side. Okay, this is your occipital bone. This one is your temporal bone, and there's 1 on the other side as well. Your sphenoid bone is a kind of a central bone, and you can see it in several different orientations, but on this particular view, this pink one, that is your sphenoid bone. And then the ethmoid bone is deep inside here. You can't really see it really well on this particular picture, so it's kind of deep into the skull is your ethmoid bone. And we'll identify it in another view a little easier. So your frontal bone, and so think about your frontal region. So we've already learned that as a region name. Your frontal region is your forehead. So the bone that's in that region is called the frontal bone. Parietal means wall, so this kind of forms the wall of your skull. Your occipital bone is back here. Temporal, your temporal region of your skull, so it forms the temporal bone. So again, these are going to be your 8 cranial bones, and we're going to go through each one of these bones and identify the structures that you need to know. All right, so let's see if we can identify these bones without the color codes. Okay, so let's look at this skull because we're looking at one without the colors associated with it. This would be your frontal bone. This would be your parietal bone, your temporal bone, back here, occipital bone, your sphenoid bone, and again, it's kind of hard to see your ethmoid bone down in there. I'll show you a better view of the ethmoid a little bit later. Here is your coronal suture. Here is your sagittal suture, and again, your squamosal suture, and again, your sagittal suture would be running along the top here. All right, so again, think of these not only as the images, the diagrams, the colored diagrams, but also as the actual skulls. Okay, again, we also want to identify those exact same bones from the inside of the skull. All right, so let's identify the frontal bone. If you saw this image, I would be able to ask you, name this bone. This is still the frontal bone, even though you're looking at it from the inside. This is still the parietal bone. This is still the occipital bone. This is still the temporal bone. Here is our sphenoid bone, and here is our ethmoid bone. Right there. So now you can see your ethmoid bone from this view. Again, looking inside of a skull, you would need to be able to recognize your frontal bone, your parietal bone, your occipital bone, your temporal bone. A little tougher to see your ethmoid bone here. This would be your sphenoid bone. So again, these are a little bit tougher. I will try to have little clearer pictures for your exam. And then again, I may find some other images, so just because you've been used to seeing it either color coordinated or on an actual skull, you may see some of these computer generated images as well. because I'm able to sometimes highlight these bones a little easier. So you can see your parietal bone, your frontal bone, your temporal bone, occipital bone, sphenoid bone, and the ethmoid bone is going to be in there. All right, so again, many different ways to test you on it. They're all the same bone, just different views with different colorations or textures. All right, so let's start with the frontal bone. We're going to talk about the frontal bone and give you some of the features. Now, if you look at the frontal bone, this is the frontal bone, and it goes all the way to that coronal suture. So I'm just going to draw the coronal suture kind of right here so you can identify where that would be. It's kind of, it got cut off on the top of the picture. And it comes around, actually this is a suture that separates the frontal bone. So the frontal bone makes the top of the orbit of the eye. Okay, so your eye would be right here. So the top of that orbit is actually part of the frontal bone. Okay, and it comes down just to the top of the bridge of the nose. And then it goes all the way around again to that coronal suture. Now, the features that you need to know are your supraorbital notch, supraorbital margin with notch. Now, a margin is just a ridge line, okay, a sharp ridge line. So this ridge line that forms the top of your orbit of your eye, that's the supraorbital margin. This little notch here, that's the notch. So on the lab test, it may say name that feature, and you would say supraorbital margin. If it said name the bone, you would say frontal bone. Okay, so again, pay attention to the questions on the exam. A lot of times people answer what they think I'm asking instead of actually reading the question. Am I asking you the bone or am I asking you the feature? Be sure to read that. All right, so that's your frontal bone. And again, there's some other angles at which to look at that, so you want to take some time. Also go to your practice anatomy lab in mastering into the study area. So if you go to the study area in the PAL, which is practice anatomy lab, there's a whole section on bones, and they've got some nice images for you to look at various different angles. So make sure you spend some time in the PAL area studying your bones as well. All right, so the parietal bone is going to be separated from the frontal bone by the coronal suture, and then the sagittal suture will separate this parietal bone from this parietal bone. And on the back, here's our lambdoidal suture, so it's separated from the occipital bone by that suture. Okay, so you have your coronal suture, your sagittal suture, and your occipital suture that you can see define the edges of the parietal bone. And on the side, the squamosal suture defines the side edge. So this bone is completely surrounded by those 4 sutures that we talked about earlier. Okay, so this is your parietal bone here, and you can also identify it from here. There are no features that you need to know for the parietal bone. All right, the occipital bone. So this bone here, the reason this is called the lambdoid suture, lambda is an upside down Y. So if you trace the sagittal suture and then outline the lambdoidal suture, it makes an upside down Y, which is how it got its name. So this brown bone is the occipital bone. It's a very thick bone on the back side of your head, and it comes all the way around underneath the skull like this. Okay, so it's you can identify it from the back and also from underneath. And we have a couple of features that you need to learn about the occipital bone. The foramen magnum, which literally means big hole, and that's this big hole right here. Okay, so that's where your spinal cord exits the brain and then goes into your vertebral column. On either side of the foramen magnum are these 2 bulges, and these are called your occipital condyles. Now remember, as we learn our feature names, we want to figure out what do these words mean. So the word condyle means rocker. So these are the rockers on either side of your foramen magnum, and these articulate or join the top of your vertebral column and allows your head to rock up and down and allows you to do the yes movement. Okay, so you can nod your head because your occipital condyles articulate with the top of your vertebral column at these occipital condyles. All right, your next bone is a sphenoid bone, and it's called the bat-shaped bone. Have you noticed it looks like a bat? It's got little wings, almost like little ears here. All right, so that's your sphenoid bone. You can see it inside the skull, so I'm outlining it here. That would be your sphenoid bone, and I've got a nice bigger picture here. Here's your sphenoid bone here. And you can also see it from the outside. So let me go to back to this other picture earlier to show you. So your sphenoid bone is that bone that kind of forms right in front of your temporal bone is your sphenoid bone. All right, so some features you need to know about the sphenoid bone. It has greater and lesser wings. So if you were able to pull this sphenoid bone out and isolate it, these large wings are the greater wings, and what I said look like ears, those are the lesser wings. Okay, the greater wings and the lesser wings. So when you're looking at a skull from the outside, what you're seeing, this area here, that is part of the greater wing. So again, if you looked at this a skull and I said name that bone, you would say sphenoid. If I said name that feature, it would be the greater wing. Okay. All right, you can also see the greater wing if you're looking in the skull. It's this area here. This is your greater wing here, your greater wing here. These are your lesser wings. Okay, so you can see the lesser wings are these little things that point right here. These make up your lesser wings. You have something called the sella turcica. Sella turcica. And that means Turkish saddle. And this is the depression right here. Your pituitary gland actually hangs down from below your brain and sits into this little depression here as a nice protective spot, a little seat for your pituitary gland. So that is known as your sella turcica. You also have what are called the optic foramina, and I'm going to go to this picture here. And if you look, it's inside. I'm sorry. Let me go back here. If you look, let me get a eraser. There we go. Your optic foramina are where your optic nerves, how your optic nerves go from your eyeballs back to your brain. All right. So if you imagine these little holes right here, I lost my pen. These little holes right here, these are your optic foramina. So the let me go to a picture from the front. So your eyeballs would be sitting right here, and you would have your optic nerves, and they would go backwards into a little hole about right there called the optic foramina. Not this little slanty thing. Okay, it's just medial and superior to that little slanty thing. All right, now that reminds me, I want to show you on this particular slide, you can also see the sphenoid bone. So let me go to my eraser again. All right. Whoops. And what you're seeing, what's making the back part of the orbit of the eye, that is your sphenoid bone. And I like to call this the evil eye. Above the evil eye is the lesser wing, and then below the evil eye is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. So you can also identify that bone from looking at the skull from the front. All right, and then lastly, you have sinuses associated with the sphenoid bone, and those are just spaces within the bone. You can't see those on an actual skull. You have to pull the bones out to see that. So I don't usually test you on that, but I do want you to know what the sinuses are for. The sinuses allow the bone to not be so dense or so heavy, and so we have spaces within our bone called sinuses. So again, you can't identify them on this particular slide, but you can see that on a diagram. All right, so the ethmoid bone. If you're looking at the ethmoid bone,